Welcome to Independence, the FIEC podcast. My name's Phil Topham, Executive Director of the FIEC, and it's time for our dive into the news as we do regularly on this pod. And with me today, two people who, with me, are looking forward to the renationalisation of the railways under the new government. It's Rachel Sloan, our Director for Women's Ministry. Hello, Rachel.
Hello.
And John Stevens, our National Director, is with us as well. Good morning, John.
Hi, Phil. I'm probably the one who's old enough to remember this is the age of the train and the egg sandwiches you used to get on British Rail. So
absolutely.
Am I delirious about that prospect? Not really.
I think I'm right in saying, and is this topical, that Screaming Lord Sutch, who was in charge of the Monster Raving Loony Party, tried to find the Loch Ness Monster using British Rail sandwiches as bait? I'm sure that happened in the late 80s or early 90s. And these are memories from my childhood.
My granddad used to be a train driver on GWR, and he was in GWR when it was an independent company and then went right through when it was nationalised.
Wow.
So I think back to steam, that's the real way to go.
Excellent. All the way back to steam, the most inefficient form of transport in terms of energy usage. Brilliant. Well, we'll come on to a bit of that when we talk about what's happened in the first couple of weeks of our new government a little bit later on. Before we get there, a few things happening in the FIEC world. It's the summer months, but things are still happening apace. John, this week you have been involved, or last week I think it was, in further discussions with Affinity and other partners about the possibility of a Gospel Coalition UK. Can you give us a bit of an update about where those discussions are at? Affinity put something out last week, which we can link in the show notes, but you were at the meeting. Just give us a bit of a potted feedback.
Affinity has been considering the possibility whether this would be a good thing for the gospel and for unity amongst evangelicals, conservative evangelicals in the UK. Affinity has been around for since 1952 or thereabouts. It doesn't quite encompass everyone, particularly Anglicans, particularly those coming from a New Frontiers kind of background. So the question has been, is there a way of helping embrace a broader kind of unity around our core convictions? This was really the first meeting with a slightly wider group than the Affinity Council, just to consider the possibility and hear people's feedback. There were about 25 people there. It was great that Graham Nichols could gather together a broad range of leaders from different constituencies. There was a very honest conversation looking at both positives and negatives about that move. So it's not by any means a decided issue. People are thinking carefully about it, whether it would serve. It moves on to a next stage of what might it look like in practice, taking into account some of the hesitations that were raised. So it was a really helpful and useful and honest discussion. And at the very least, it's got evangelicals from a variety of constituencies talking with one another about how they can best stand together in the gospel.
Well, do pray about it and contemplate feeding back into it and giving your feedback if that's something you're passionate about one way or the other, because Graham and the team at Affinity really want to hear from all sides on that. So do please get involved if you're interested in doing so. Rachel, this week we've announced the seminars for our Leaders Conference, all sorts planned as we think about the theme of shepherding. Some highlights there that you'd want to pick out, perhaps one or two things that we can look forward to?
Yeah, so I think there's a whole range of things, particularly looking at how we shepherd various individuals within our church families, which is exciting to think about. So whether looking at parents, those who are suffering, different things like that, those facing domestic abuse. So different topics alongside that. Eleanor and I are going to be running another afternoon seminar for all the women who are at the conference. So whether you're there as a woman in ministry, as a pastor's wife or an elder's wife, we'd love to see you. And we're going to be thinking particularly about what it means for us to, I guess, feed from our shepherd and how that then helps us in our roles. I think often we can go straight to how do we help those people in front of us and not always spend time thinking, well, actually, we need to feed ourselves from Jesus. We need to hear from him. We need to settle our hearts with him first and foremost. So how do we do that? And so we'll be kind of spending some time doing that in our time together.
Excellent. That'll be the Tuesday lunchtime, won't it? So lunch together and with the other women at the conference, then into that seminar in the afternoon. And Rachel, just while we're talking about our conferences for ministries for women, just tell us a bit about the dates for Thrive and the Ministry Wives Retreat in 2025, just so people can mark their diaries. I think they're fixed, aren't they?
Yes, they are fixed. Yep. So Thrive is the 19th and the 20th of May next year. Into the 21st, and then the ministry wise will be the 21st, so that's the Wednesday to the Friday, which is the 23rd. So we're back at the Hayes again, and we're looking forward to having Lizzie Smallwood come and speak to us and share. So it was a great time together. It's great to see how both these times have grown over the past couple of years, more women in ministry coming, more ministry wives. And I think we're really wanting to encourage, particularly for the Women in Ministry Conference, a whole range of women to come. So those who are involved in, for example, admin or pastoral care, biblical counselling, youth work, and ministry to women, to see that this is a time for them to come together. So it's not just for kind of women's workers in that sense. We'd really want people to see the kind of wide range of roles that women are involved in and the kind of participation they can have and come and have some time away from work and do that.
Excellent. And John, this past Sunday you were at Wimbledon, but not for the men's final. You were there to commemorate the ministry of Richard Cokin, who stepped back as lead pastor at Dundonald and from his role in commission. So a joyful time, I guess, as we look back on his ministry.
Yeah, it was a great Sunday. Richard has stepped down as senior pastor after 29 years leading Dundonald. There were a number of us there. Ray Evans, our leadership consultant, was also there for the service. We just wanted to be there to support Richard in that. It was a really a joyful service, I think, reflecting on God's goodness and how he'd been at work through Richard's ministry, leading a church really from being a relatively small and new church plant to, as Richard described it, a relatively ordinary, medium-sized church that has gone through a couple of major building projects that is seeking to reach the community of Rains Park with the good news of the gospel. It was great to be able to be with the church congregation, to hear lots of stories of Richard's ministry and individuals who've been benefited from that, those who've been converted through that ministry, those who Richard and his wife Sian have walked alongside through pain and difficulty and struggle in their life. So it was really encouraging, and I think a testimony to the real value of a long-term kind of gospel ministry that grows the church. Richard preached from Psalm 96, verses 1-4, and really left the church with two words: sing and proclaim, which is a great way of describing what we're all about. We're to sing the praises of Jesus, and our proclamation of the gospel overflows from the joy that we have in him. So I found that personally challenging and encouraging. Richard has not just been involved in Dundonald, but also commission, helping to plant churches and encourage church revitalisations across southwest London. A number of FIEC churches are part of commission, and they've benefited from that wider network. Richard's going on to develop a ministry called Reach Ministries UK, which is going to be serving, helping to equip church leaders. Rachel spoke at their conference earlier this year, so Rachel might be able to say something a little bit about that. But Richard is working with particularly Ray Evans and Matt Waldock, both of whom are FIEC kind of pastors, and we hope that this will be a way that churches can be helped. He wants to help pastors to become effective in gospel ministry. And some of those lessons that have been learnt can be shared more widely.
Rachel, you did speak at Reach, didn't you, I think? And it's great that ministry will move forward now and under Richard's leadership. Yeah,
no, it was a great time together, and a kind of good, I think, first conference to get people to think about how, I guess just how we can be effective in gospel ministry. We want to see more people come to know Christ. And so that does mean that every so often we need to be looking at how our churches are working, how we're working together as staff teams, how our ministries are working, and actually, do the hard things of saying, is this actually doing what we want it to do? Are we working together as well as we can as a team? And all the time doing it because we want to see God's name lifted high, and we want people to know Him, not because we just want to be known as effective, efficient gospel workers, but actually we're doing it because we love people and we love God. And so I think it'll be a very helpful ministry that he's kind of taking on with others.
Excellent. Let's talk about some of the news stories that have been dominating in recent days. An extraordinary weekend that has just passed with the assassination attempt of Donald Trump, former president, of course, and presidential candidate for the Republican Party in November's elections over in the USA. It seemed to me that we'd spent the previous few days talking about how the elections had been run in Britain, and there was some pretty strong rhetoric on both sides. That rhetoric has been running through the upcoming election campaign in the States as well. And it seems that rhetoric, for some reason, led to what happened over the weekend, this assassination attempt on the former president. And whatever your politics are, absolutely appalling to see this playing out in a democratic nation. I just couldn't believe what I was reading when I woke up. I think it was Sunday morning. Unbelievable, John.
I mean, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's appalling. I mean, at one level, I think we have to recognise we don't quite know what the motivations of the shooter were in this instance. He's been identified, but there hasn't been a deep dive into what might have motivated him to do this. Sadly and tragically, political violence is common. Again, we're shocked by it. At one level in America, there are regular mass shootings. There's been a history of assassinations and assassination attempts. One thinks of kind of Robert Kennedy being assassinated back in the 1960s, an attempt to assassinate Ronald Reagan. And it's not confined to America. One thinks, for example, fairly recently of Shinzo Abe, the Japanese president, former prime minister, was kind of assassinated. I think it's in Slovakia where one of the key people was recently, again, attacked and shot. So people obviously feel very passionate about politics and become very angry about politics, and sometimes that spills over in some people in relation to a kind of violence. So I think everybody's got to be grateful and thankful that Donald Trump survived, that he wasn't killed. I think that moment leads to a coming together as people dial down the rhetoric. But I think you're right. There's a bigger issue here of the rhetoric with which we speak of our opponents politically. It's so easy for rhetoric to be able to be ramped up. Again, we see that in our own election campaign. It's immediately after the election, Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer are actually really kind of quite pleasant about each other, describing each other as decent, honourable men. Well, that's not the way they spoke about each other and their policies in the debates and the manifestos. So people do speak in this kind of rhetorical way. And in America, that seems to be supercharged. I mean, sort of Biden sort of recognizing he shouldn't have said that he wanted to put a bullseye on Trump. But we even see it, J.D. Vance, the kind of vice president pick. I mean, he said in the past that Trump was the equivalent of America's Hitler. That's the kind of language that is used. And that can only exacerbate the anger of some people and cause them to feel justified in taking that kind of action. I think it's a reminder to us all about the way that we speak, particularly about those that we oppose. And actually, tragically, Christians can fall into exactly that same kind of escalation of rhetoric. You see it online. You see it in the ways that people might speak about each other in their preaching, the ways that they attack each other at conferences and events. Actually, we hype up the language in order to shore up our own side and to raise opposition. And ultimately, that can create a very unhealthy culture.
It's interesting, isn't it, Rachel? Because the Bible is very clear on how we should speak. And it's interesting that when Christians get caught up in some of this rhetoric, which we do see happening online and I guess in our churches, we do need to remind ourselves the clear teachings of Scripture in the way we should use our tongues.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I'm always challenged by what the Bible has to say. Paul says in Ephesians that we should be using words that build others up and are beneficial to those who listen. And James is very clear that we should be slow to speak. And I think, especially in our culture, in our world at the moment, on social media and when we're doing things online, it's very easy just to type something out and say something quickly without realizing in some ways you're still talking to a real human being who's made in the image of God. And other people are going to be watching and taking that and learning from you. And I think particularly if you're in any form of leadership, then you're setting an example in how you are interacting with others. And I think we have to be willing to be challenged on that and then take what God's word says seriously about that. Because our words matter and the example we set in our words matter. And I think we actually, in these kind of areas, should be taking more time to listen to what other people are saying and try and dig a little bit deeper why they believe what they believe and why they hold that position so tightly and kind of are so passionate about it, and use that as an example to get to know them and see how the gospel speaks into those situations, I think.
So John,
I think just worth reflecting. I think that that doesn't mean to say there's no place for disagreeing with people or even for exposing arguments that you think are wrong, false teaching or error. The danger is when that becomes demonizing people as individuals and legitimating violence sort of against them. So Jesus was quite happy to engage in a kind of debate, disagreement, to correct those who were wrong, but that never flowed over into a personal demonizing or an encouragement of violence. I think actually Paul's kind of reminder in Ephesians that our struggle is not primarily against flesh and blood, but against spiritual powers that lie behind that, is really helpful to enable us to have compassion towards the person whilst even disagreeing very strongly with what they might be saying and what they might be doing. And I think we need to remember Jesus basically stopped his disciples fighting on his behalf. He healed the high priest's servant's ear that was cut off by Peter. It was clearly wrong for him to take violent action. At that point, the kingdom of God, the gospel, doesn't spread through violence. It spreads through the proclamation of the good news about Jesus.
Absolutely. Let's bring it to this side of the Atlantic and talk about the politics here for a few minutes. So, with the first 2 weeks of a new government, so we talked with Andy Hunter on the pod a couple of weeks ago, the day after the general election. The Labour Party have not wasted any time in putting their stamp on things, I think it's fair to say. Worth saying, we're recording before the King's speech. This is Wednesday morning. I'm not sure when this podcast will go out, but this is Wednesday morning. So we've not heard the King's speech yet. We've had some clues about what's going to be in it. Rachel, has it surprised you how quickly some of the things have been, some of the planning laws have been ripped up, for example, some things have changed very, very swiftly. Has that impacted Scotland at all, or has that really been something that we've perhaps seen more in England?
I mean, this is when I'm going to show some of my slight ignorance on what's been happening. So probably not, hasn't affected much, but I guess it just is, it shows the heart behind the new government, doesn't it, of kind of actually wanting to distance themselves from what happened before, and to a degree try and show that they're going to do something bigger and better. Time will tell whether that is true or not, isn't it? But I guess they are taking the opportunity to show that what was before they didn't agree with. They want to make a big difference. Change is what they're aiming for, really, isn't it?
It has happened quickly, John, hasn't it? Some of the changes that they've wanted to bring in, it's faster than I thought it would be in terms of some of the things that they did almost within the first few days of taking office.
Yeah, and in some ways that parallels 1997 when Tony Blair took over. And I think when you come in on a message of you're going to change and put things right, there is, in a sense, a great pressure to do things and to demonstrate that a difference is being made, which is why the King's speech is full of different kinds of legislation, some of which is about dealing with practical issues like planning, some of which is more symbolic in terms of enacting promises within the manifesto, maybe conversion therapy, maybe the smoking ban that was in the sort of Labour manifesto. But they obviously want to create the impression that they are making a difference rapidly. And of course, one of the challenges is that many of the issues that people are struggling with, issues, for example, of not having housing, maybe issues of dealing with immigration and the large number of small boats that are coming over, actually, those are not things that can be changed quickly. There's not going to be an on the ground, very rapid, sort of several 100,000 new houses built, or kind of a decrease in the number of people crossing the channel. So the government's pressure is they want to be shown that they're changing things and making a difference, but actually often it will be long term before those changes begin to be really implemented. So the creation of a sense of change. It's interesting that at the same time, what they're doing is they're clearly wanting to set up a whole variety of reviews. Their message has been, when we've come into office, it was far worse than we thought. The NHS is broken, according to Wes Streeting. They're about to commission another defence review. It's clear that what they're doing there is trying to look back on the past record and basically stack up why it's harder to put things right than maybe their promises might have suggested. So in a way, they're almost wanting from the off to show they're doing something, but also protecting themselves against the fact that it's going to be more difficult to do that. Now, at one level, that is natural politics, trash the record of those that have gone beforehand, and then be seen to be doing things that are different. So I guess with a massive popular mandate demanding change, that's what they've got to do, because they're already thinking about the next election and whether they're going to be able to sustain the majority that they've got. Now, that might be good politics. I think for me, one of the interesting parallels here is when somebody becomes a new leader of a church or a Christian organisation, and particularly where you've perhaps come into something where you think it needs change, where maybe there are things that haven't been going particularly well. Do you approach that with that same energetic, let's make lots and lots of change, let's kind of trash the record of what went beforehand? Or do you adopt a more gentle, patient, getting to know people, carrying them with you. I guess in many church situations, you might not come in with quite the mandate that the Labour government has to bring about change. And therefore, there's a lot of wisdom in taking it slowly and carrying people with you, for, in a sense, building on what went beforehand, even if you didn't think it was perfect, to recognise that those who served before will have been faithfully seeking to do their best in the circumstances. I think history and experience shows that sometimes if a pastor comes in new to a church and they want to change everything very quickly and make their mark, sometimes that alienates those who are there. It actually prevents their ability to be able to bring about the long-term sustained change that would be better achieved in a wiser and more patient way.
And we've all been part of Christian leadership teams where there have been changes in that team. Things will be done differently. Rachel, how do we graciously welcome somebody new into a role, help them to settle, but also recognise that there will be things they want to do differently? What advice would you give to people in that situation who are seeing kind of changes happen in their leadership structures and teams, whether in church or church ministries more widely?
I mean, I think you've mentioned some of it in just what you said, like doing it graciously, actually recognising that change can be good, and so actually again taking time to sit down with people and unpack some of the reasons why they want to do what they want to do, why do they see that change happen. I think we can hold very tightly to ministries and certain ways of doing it because we've always done it that way and it's comfortable to us, rather than actually that's the biblical and the right way to do it. And so we have to be very good at discerning between the two. We want to hold clear to the gospel, we want to hold clear to biblical truth and teach that rightly, but recognizing that there's many and varied ways to do that, aren't there? And so actually I think that's what's going to see ongoing growth in our churches actually, is to have that heart to be willing to change the right things. We hold tightly to the things that we cannot and should not ever change, but actually the rest of it should always be open to change. And so I think we should never think of change as a bad thing. But at the same time, I think, as John mentioned, there's wisdom in doing things slowly. On the other side, isn't it? You'll get to know the people in the church, get to know why they, again, hold certain things dear and do things in certain ways. Because, again, we can often come into a new ministry and think the way that I do it is the right way. It may be the better way, but you don't want to kind of go in with that attitude of it's, I'm right, you're wrong, let's do it this way. I don't think that helps bring people along with you.
I think, Phil, politics is inherently divisive in that you've got a group of people who are your supporters who voted for you, and they're giving you the ability to do what you want. And at one level, the people who are on the other side, you don't quite have to serve them in the same way. There is sort of sometimes a conflict of interest between different groups and what they might want. That's very different from church, where as a body, a family as a whole, actually we're constantly wanting to try to bring the whole body together in a kind of unity. And therefore, actually, a dividing the body up into different sections, support groups. At one level, you can do that and get things done, but that actually undermines the very nature of what the church is meant to be. And I think the task of the leadership of church leadership, is to carry the body together in as far as possible as a whole. And that just requires love for the people, patience, understanding, a lot of emotional intelligence, wisdom, an awful lot of time listening to people, speaking to people. The bulldozer leadership is unlikely to maintain that unity of the church.
I mentioned at the beginning the renationalisation of the railways rather frivolously. A couple of weeks ago on the podcast, we talked about something that's likely to be in the King's speech today, which is the conversion therapy ban bill. We touched on that a couple of weeks ago. John, are there any other things on the list today that you think Christians should be aware of, to be thinking about?
Most of the legislation seems to be about economic issues and the economic plans of the government to be able to introduce achieve growth. We don't quite know what they'll say about conversion therapy at this point. There's also some kind of question of what they will say in relation to gender recognition and all of the issues connected with transgenderism. The government has said that they're going to continue to ban puberty blockers under the age of 18, which is a good decision in the light of the Cass review. At the same time, they seem to probably be making it slightly easier for people to change their kind of gender. It's unlikely to be in the King's speech, but Keir Starmer has indicated he wants a free vote in Parliament on the whole issue of assisted suicide. So I think that will come. It won't come as a government measure, but it will be something that I think this Parliament will address, and I suspect the Christians will need to engage with that quite significantly. The government's proposals in relation to charging VAT on fees for private schools, we can think of that in terms of kind of Eton and Harrow, but actually that's going to have a significant implication for actually quite a lot of relatively small private Christian schools where Christian parents have come together not to buy their kids an elite education, but to provide them with what they believe to be a sort of a biblical Christian kind of education. And unless there are exemptions for smaller schools, it means that parents in those kinds of contexts are going to be paying another 20-30% more. So it's going to make it more difficult for Christians to set up schools that reflect something of their ethos, which they have the freedom to do, but it will financially become more difficult. So that might not seem a high profile or significant issue for lots of people, but there are small Christian schools dotted all across the country, and they're going to be significantly impacted by that measure.
Well, we wait and see what is in the speech. Rachel, let's move on to a story that you picked out for us to talk about. And this comes from BBC's Strictly Come Dancing and the fact that there will be chaperones now available to the celebrities who go on to Strictly Come Dancing after allegations of bullying were made against some of the professional dancers. Just outline your take on this story and then perhaps how it kind of relates to our work and ministry.
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways there's two aspects of it which I think are quite fascinating. One, just I think we have to be clear there's certain standards of behaviour that are unacceptable, whether you're teaching someone to dance or leading a church or whatever it is. And actually, if bullying has gone on in how they've tried to encourage their celebrities, then that's not right. But at the same time, just the kind of, I guess it reveals the level of the human heart, doesn't it? That we're now at a stage where even in a dancing competition, people cannot be alone. They need someone else to kind of watch how they're doing their behaviour, and just that kind of challenge of, and almost like an outside person checking that this is the right thing for that person, that people aren't being offended by how they're being told what to do, that the pressure isn't too much for people. And yeah, that kind of challenge. So I guess in our ministries, part of it is, again, that sense of how our behaviour is understood by other people makes a huge difference. But also the kind of the checking our own hearts and our own behaviour, that we're not being too forceful or coercive in how we want things to be done. There's a kind of a fine line in that, isn't there?
I think it also shows that things have changed so quickly in culture. So I don't know if you picked up this week, Craig Bellamy's the new Wales football manager, but he was called out for the way he'd behaved in a youth team in the past. And it seems that one of the things that he was called out for was for celebrating England losing in front of England fans, young boys. And this was deemed to be inappropriate. And it just makes you realise that we can't just have one standard that is forever the way that we lead and teach and move things forward. Is that a fair assessment, John?
Yeah, I mean, it is. I mean, it's worth saying, actually, just in relation to Strictly, actually, there's been a lot of critique of dance schools and ballet schools in terms of bullying of individuals. I mean, at the highest level, it is incredibly skilled and requires an immense amount of training. And at one level, you're asking people who perhaps haven't danced before or have very limited dance experience to kind of develop to quite a high level in quite a short period of time. So the culture is not just in Strictly, but actually more widely across the whole field of dancing and pushing people to elite sort of performance and how you treat them. And I think that's a massive challenge. How do you push people on to be as good as they can possibly be? And the role of the coach, is that all just encouragement, or is there pushing? I think in every field of life, that's a very difficult balance. What is the difference between legitimate training and kind of what amounts to a bullying and coercion? And the same is true in relation to sports like athletics. We've had all sorts of stuff about swimming coaches, gymnastics coaches. So I do think this is a really difficult thing to navigate. I think in Strictly, it's worth recognising Strictly is entertainment. And there's this real kind of pressure in relation to entertainment. I mean, there are certain tropes that appear on Strictly regularly. We know that on sort of every Strictly, there'll be the semi-comedy candidate who is not going to be very good, but everybody's going to have a laugh, the kind of John Sargent kind of character. You know that you're going to have the person who's overcome some kind of very significant personal adversity, and then everybody is behind them because of those circumstances. Then you've probably got a range of people who could be very good, could be outstanding dancers, only with kind of the input. So we do need to remember that people are doing this for entertainment. And at one level, we need to realize that Christian ministry is not entertainment. We're not into pushing forward various tropes for our own kind of entertainment. Our desire is to want to see the gifts that people have been given being fully used within the body of Christ. We need to recognize that people have different levels of gifting. So it's a real problem to expect more from people than they've been gifted by God. They need to be honored for the gifts that they've got. At the same time, there is a right and proper place for encouraging people to use the fullness of the gifting that they've been given to serve the body, but primarily through encouragement, and absolutely not from a kind of a bullying. And again, we've seen, sadly, in Christian circles, leaders who have effectively bullied others, whether that be critiquing their sermons in harsh ways, asking them to do things that they shouldn't be expected to do. We need to learn from that.
Mm-hmm. Let's move on to one final story that we just want to pick up on before we come to a conclusion. England got very close, but didn't quite do it this past weekend in the Euros. Interesting, less than 48 hours later, Gareth Southgate steps back as England manager. He'd had a pretty successful 8 years, taken England further in tournaments in the men's game than all of his predecessors for a long time, really. Yet he stepped back. I just wonder what lessons there are for us there in terms of the way we think about how long we go on in ministry. When is the right time to stop? I don't know. John, just pick up on that for us to start with, then we'll come to Rachel.
Well, I think you're absolutely right to say that Gareth Southgate is the most successful England manager in terms of his record, how he's sort of got to either finals, semi-finals, quarterfinals of major championships. And he seems to have been able to bear the immense pressure of fans. We shouldn't forget that he took over when England were in a pretty dire state. And he's brought about remarkable results from that. I don't think anybody's massively surprised that he stepped down. There was actually some kind of thought that he might have stepped down after the last World Cup. So at one level, he stayed on. He seems to have had a real loyalty to the players and wanted to enable them to succeed. We don't know exactly why he stepped down, but I would guess he thinks that he's probably taken them as far as he can. He's given 8 years of his life to it. And as he said, it's time for somebody else to take the team sort of forward. So I don't think anybody can say that he's stepping away from responsibility. He's done an astonishing job of turning the team around over that time. And he always said that it would be a decision for him, listening to the players, reflecting on himself and his own circumstances. He obviously feels this is the right moment for him to hand over to somebody else. And again, I think in Christian ministry, when people have been leading for a period of time, they might come to the conclusion that it is right for them to hand over to somebody else. Maybe they realize they've no longer got it anymore. They haven't got the energy, the drive. They haven't got the ideas to take people further. They've recognized their own limitations. There's nothing wrong with recognizing that actually you're not the right person to take people on to the next stage. And there's a real problem with people clinging on to position when they no longer have anything new to bring to help take things forward. So churches can end up being held back by leaders who are simply clinging on to their roles. So We don't know the circumstances, but I think all one can say he's done an astonishing job for 8 years. He's taken an immense amount of criticism and borne it. I've said this online and elsewhere. I came across a great quote on the Today programme, which said of Gareth Southgate that what stood out about him is when there was criticism, he took it on himself. When there was praise, he directed it to the players.
Yeah,
and I think that's an extraordinary example of leadership from which we can all learn. So I think what we can do is wish Gareth Southgate well for the future. I think there'll be a great challenge finding somebody to come on and take on the role at this stage. I mean, we talked about kind of Christian leadership and seeking to bring about change. Actually, it's pretty difficult to take on leadership from someone who's had a very successful and strong record, particularly when there's so much expectation. The fan expectation is extraordinary. The fact that we think that England ought to always win. That is in a way a remarkable arrogance. It's understandable why the Scots and the Welsh and the kind of Northern Irish might look at us askance in that way. But there is this sort of assumption England deserves to win. Well, we're one of a number of significant major world footballing nations. There are plenty of other nations our size that haven't won, that don't win. We have to remember the vast majority don't win. And so the expectations on a manager to deliver a particular result, I can't imagine living under that sort of pressure.
Rachel, just picking up on something John said there, very hard for the next guy. Like, what does that, I mean, thinking about perhaps it's somebody who's been a minister or a women's worker in a church for a long time and has been well loved in their role. They won't have got everything right, nobody does, but very well loved by the church, by the people they've been leading. How do you follow that?
Graciously. I guess my other thought is there is an element where if you can, you want to be preparing your church for that. And so knowing that you're moving on, knowing that you're stepping down from your role, you want to be making sure that the church is ready for the next person and that they welcome them with open arms. I think, as John said, you can lead in such a way where you don't do that well and you make your ministry in some ways all about you and this success that you've done and the things that you've put in place. And so when someone else comes in, it makes it hard to change because they're like, well, that's what so-and-so always did. This is how it's always been done. But actually, I think the onus is as much on those who are welcoming the new person as it is on the person who's left to leave the door wide open for the new person so that they can happily make changes, happily build on the strong foundation that is there, but also allow God to use their gifts and their abilities in this new way.
Going back to what Gareth Southgate's done at England, I think the thing that he can hold his head really high for is not just the success on the pitch, but the way he's changed the culture. So I listened to a really interesting podcast from a former player who played football in the Premier League in the 2000s. He basically said he had no interest in being in the England team because of how divided it was. So he said it was divided north-south, it was divided Arsenal, Man United. He had no interest in being part of it because it was just basically a divided team. And I think what Gareth Southgate's done incredibly is create a culture where these guys want to come together for the common good and seek to take the team forward. And I think there's a great lesson there for churches as well. We want to create cultures, don't we, in our church, which are healthy and that people want to be part of them. And that's exactly what Gareth Southgate's done for England.
Interesting. I was listening to an interview with Harry Redknapp actually on the radio yesterday. He was talking about the England manager job and basically said, as an England manager, you don't get to do a great deal of coaching of the players. That's all done in their teams. You're bringing them together and blending them together. And he said, essentially, it's a man management job. That is actually the very heart of what the England manager has to do, which is quite different from the roles of Premiership managers and coaches at that level. I thought that was a quite interesting insight. And I think Gareth Southgate has shown himself to be an incredibly gifted man manager in terms of bringing the best out of people. If you think about the team, the pain of the penalty failures in the last Euros final and some of the same guys playing in the team, playing with kind of confidence, that is a remarkable achievement to help people to be able to overcome sort of failure like that and to give them the confidence to continue to play. I actually think in Christian ministry, so much of what we're doing is actually giving people confidence and encouragement. I think the reality is that most Christians in most churches, it's not that they're lazy. It's not that they don't want to serve Christ. I think actually for a lot of people, they lack confidence. They lack encouragement. They're fearful of trying. And I think so much of church ministry is about wanting to encourage people to be able to serve Christ joyfully, to be willing to contemplate the possibility of failing and not necessarily achieving what they would want to do. So in a sense, there's a difference between the pastor who beats people up, and almost every sermon is a kind of exhortation to do more. You're not doing enough, as against the pastor who genuinely, lovingly encourages the people to be confident in Christ and to serve him. I think there are some lessons there for us.
Confidence in Christ. It sounds like a good place to finish. So we've had politics on both sides of the pond. We've had dancing. We've had football. This has been Independence, the FIEC podcast. Hope you found it helpful as we've thought about what lessons there are for churches and leaders from some of the things happening in the news. If you've enjoyed it, do rate or leave a review so others can find it. And we'll look forward to talking to you again very, very soon. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, John. God bless.
Thanks, Phil.